Okay, so declining fertility has generated demographic anxieties. I mean, this fear of economic and political consequences, shrinking labor force, aging populations, and changing family norms. And at the core of these anxieties is, of course, the sustainability of future societies. And in consequence, pro-natalist sentiments and politics have been spreading since the 2000s. An increase in fertility rates have been an explicit aim of family policies in a growing number of countries. So, my talk will be a very broad brush examination of some questions that are arising from recent changes in the Nordic fertility regime, where since the 2010 fertility rates have fallen unexpectedly. And the Nordic experiences are interesting for several reasons. First, these countries have been forerunners when it comes to advancing new family patterns and gender relations. And second, compared to many other countries, fertility has fallen from very high and rather stable levels. And third, previous high fertility has been attributed to these countries' institutional and socio-cultural context, especially the evolution of gender equality-oriented work-family policies. And fourth and last and not least, the evolution of Nordic family policies have not been motivated by pro-natalist aims. Then I try questions. Okay, so my questions are, what typifies the Nordic decline in fertility behavior and fertility intentions? And what kind of responses are manifest in public debate and political initiatives? And what are the implications for fertility theories and for the goals of work-family policy? So this is a more detailed picture of the total fertility rates in the Nordic countries, and you have a line with you can compare with the EU average. And you can see that in 2024, Nordic fertility rates varied between 1.56 and 1.25, Iceland versus Finland. So, Nordic fertility rates have been quite similar, so it has earned the notion of a Nordic fertility regime. And this has included the steady postponement of first motherhood, but fertility recuperation at higher childbearing ages, and stable cohort fertility near the replacement rate. However, this, as Thomas has shown, this regime has been reshaping. While the fertility decline in the 1970s to the mid-1980s was attributable to the effect of women giving birth later, the decline since 2010 is not fully attributed to timing effects. Women's age at first birth has continued to increase, but fertility recuperation seems to be weakening, and I mean that's part of the general picture. So, while the weak downward trends in cohort fertility that started in the 1960s birth cohort was driven by a decreasing progression to third and fourth births, the 2010s trend is driven also by increasing childlessness, as also Thomas mentioned. So, declining first birth intensities explain most of the recent decline in fertility. And the interesting thing is that this decline has been rather similar across different socioeconomic groups and also across geographical regions, with some variation in the steepness of decline. But if you look at the socioeconomic differences, you can see that while men with low education has had rather lower fertility rates, over a longer period of time, this is also now happening among women with low education. So this, as Thomas also mentioned, the difference between period and cohort fertility, there are estimations that this period fertility decline also will result in a decrease in the cohort fertility, and one estimate is from 2.0 children to 1.8 in the according to the 1919 cohorts. Also, the interesting thing is that the decline is Also, the decline in birth rates is also associated with the declining fertility intentions. And we have studies from both Norway and Sweden that show this. A Norwegian study over 50 years from 1977 to 2020 discloses that both women's general fertility intentions to have a child in the long term and the short term intentions, both these types of intentions have declined. And also we can see that these intentions, they are aligned with the fertility decline. That you can find it mostly from later births and a steep decline among young women. And women in education have lower fertility intentions. And also partnership dynamics may play a role. More than 1 in 3 women in the 30s to mid-40s lived without a partner. A Swedish study, I think Thomas mentioned this study already, and here is a study of changes in intentions from 2012 to 2021, and here they also have estimated the number of intended children dropped from 2.26 to 1.79, which is quite close to the estimate I earlier mentioned. It was especially among young in their 20s and the childless where the short-term intentions declined. But if you look at the broader picture, both short and long-term intentions declined across all socioeconomic groups. What they also found was that there was a decrease in fertility intentions also among one-child parents, and that is not aligned with the actual fertility rates. But this might signal that there is a deviation from the well-established two-child norm. So what the study suggests is that people have become more hesitant and uncertain about whether to have a child soon or ever. And this concerns all individuals of childbearing age, irrespective of their socioeconomic situation. So in sum, this unexpected development might signal a trend break, a generation shift in childbearing behavior and intentions. And intentions may signal change in fertility preferences, pointing towards an increasing recognition of smaller and also childless families. And in the Nordic countries, this change is rather surprising because there has been no deterioration in structural conditions such as the economic situation, work-family policy, and also gender equality. So it can hardly be attributed to more unfavorable conditions for having children or a rising feeling of deficient support for parents, as might be the case in other countries. Then I will turn into what kind of responses has this decline caused in the Nordic countries. And then I just want to say that data about fertility change are not immutable facts of reality, but they are subject to interpretation. And they generate what we can call demographic imaginaries, narratives which describe meaning and value to changes and also provide legitimation of policy response. Fertility change often becomes a site for public debates of the character of the nation and imaginaries of its future, and of women's role in the reproduction of the nation. And we can see that in the Nordic countries there has been an intensified debate about declining fertility, and it testifies that demographic anxieties and calls for pro-natalist policies have reached the Nordics. So I have actually studied the interpretations of fertility decline in Norwegian newspapers, and I found contested imaginaries of the consequences for the nation and also of women's reproductive role. So there are 3 competing imaginaries. One is the pronatalist, second is the adaptationist, and the third is the antinatalist. Pronatalists' imaginaries are strongly underpinned by the anxieties of the sustainability of the welfare state, which is linked to an increasing dependency burden supported by statistical projections of a shrinking labor force and more elderly people. Fertility is too low to secure the sustainability of the welfare state, and political interventions with explicit objectives of increasing fertility are called for. And sustaining the welfare state model appears as central to the national self-understanding in this imaginary. And it's interesting also that these alarmed imaginaries of too low fertility often refer explicitly to replacement level fertility of 2.1 children per woman. In contrast, adaptationist imaginaries, they reject crisis interpretations of statistical projections of labor demand and the sustainability of the welfare state. And demographers and also some economists, they express skepticism regarding the prospects for policy to reverse the trend. National population development is not an absolute framework for development and welfare, and the welfare state can adapt to lower fertility. That's the argument. And also, fertility rate at replacement level is an unrealistic goal. And it's more important to focus on how society can best adapt to lower fertility levels and an aging population. Anti-natalists, they changed the interpretive frame from the national to the global perspective. Norway needs fewer children. Hence, concerns about climate change revive the old interpretation of global overpopulation as the primary problem. The pro-natalist imaginaries concern women's reproductive choices. That women have more children is politicized as a national interest. Men's absence from the debate is striking in considering the otherwise prominent position of fathers in the policy debates. In some imaginaries, women are giving birth to few children because they are victims of structural coercion, employment-oriented work-family policies that do not sufficiently recognize motherhood. A few imaginaries saw women as the villain. Later births and fewer children is the result of women's irresponsible and individualistic lifestyle, putting the sustainability of the welfare state at risk. And also, if you look a couple of decades back, during the previous high fertility period, then women were imagined as the heroes of the welfare state. They did the right thing for the nation, both by having children and participating in the labor market. And this was considered as a huge and defining aspect of the broader Nordic welfare state model. This has sort of died out as a perspective. But there were also contrasting imaginaries to this, what was called as an instrumentalization of births. And it was argued that the autonomy of women's and men's reproductive choice was important, and that implies the freedom to have children, but also to not have them. Concerns about the potential decline in the population is irrelevant to people's autonomous choices. And some women participating in the debate, they reacted to what they perceived as a pro-natalist pressure. And here's a quote: "No one is motivated to give birth in order for the welfare state to run its business, and it's experienced as patronizing when politicians constantly remind women that their fertility has an expiration date, something women are fully aware of." Okay, so these interpretations have been contested, but demographic anxieties and pro-natalist imaginaries is what has gained political traction. And I would argue that it has caused a pro-natalist political turn in both Norway and Sweden. And this is reflected in a typical Nordic procedure. Government-appointed investigations have been appointed in both countries. And the mandates of both investigations contain explicit pro-natalist aims. They shall identify causes and consequences of the decline, but also propose measures that can increase fertility. And in Norway, the so-called birth rate committee was appointed in 2024 by a minority government of the Labour Party and the Centre Party. And the Minister of Children and Families of the latter party had stated in a previous interview that I want Norwegians to have more children. Fertility should be raised to at least 2.1 child per woman, and the minister foresaw radical changes to family policy if this could get more people to give birth and more people to have more children. And the committee report is already published. The main proposals are rather broad, including reducing exclusion, a faster transition to parenthood, and a better housing market for families with children, and a better balance between working time and family time among parents with children. And the overarching aim is to making it easier to have children at a younger age and to have more children. And the committee expressed special concern about adults in their 20s, where the decline in birth rates had been most pronounced. Hence, among the measures are economic incentives for parents under the age of 30. They have estimated how many children will these incentives produce and how much will it cost. And here you can see the figures. There were 54,000 children born in Norway in 2024, and you can see the figures. So it's not that many births, and it's rather expensive. So it will be very interesting to see how these proposals will be followed up in actual politics. The Swedish inquiry was appointed by a centre-right government in 2025. And if you look at the mandate, it refers to the current fertility rate, which is the lowest measured since the 18th century. So it's a very emphasis of how dramatic this is. And it's maintained that lower fertility has economic impact that will affect the whole society. And the causes of fertility decline have to be investigated because they may indicate deep structural changes in society. And if each generation does not reproduce itself, the ultimate consequence without migration is that population dies out. So the mandate says that the inquiry shall identify obstacles to higher birth rates, but not only higher birth rates, but also to increased equality and higher employment. And they should propose measures to strengthen family formation and thus a more family-friendly society, as well as analyze how it affects the economy in the short and long term. So it will be very interesting to see how they will square this equation of higher fertility, higher equality, and higher employment. Okay, so what is my reading of these inquiries is that they are legitimated by the assumed existence of a child gap, resulting from structural barriers towards people realizing the higher fertility preferences that they have. So the question is, how well does this assumption capture the explanations of the current fertility decline? And it's interesting to see that the previous high Nordic fertility levels inspired fertility theories that emphasized the importance of institutions and structures. And several theories explain low fertility by the lag between gender equality and in public and private institutions. For example, some of you may be familiar with the gender revolution theory. This theory suggests that there are two halves of the gender revolution. The first half is structural, advancing women's role in public sphere employment, and this disrupted traditional gender relations, having negative impacts on fertility and union stability. But the second part of the revolution involves changes in men's roles in the family, and this will produce more equitable division of labor. And the theory predicts the recuperation to replacement level fertility and greater family stability. And the Nordic countries have moved the furthest in this direction. First, I would just say that there has been a general criticism directed at this type of theories because explanations that are based on the idea of a unilinear convergence towards a new stable equilibria are highly problematic. But also in light of the current Nordic fertility decline, these types of theories are increasingly questioned. The mechanisms that underlie the Nordic decline are unclear, but evidence points beyond the influence of family policy and gender equality. And you can also argue that high levels of gender equality and work-family policies in these countries have eradicated many of the obstacles that for family formation that still exist in many other societies. So the plausibility of a fertility reversal to higher levels of fertility seems rather weak. Fertility theories have been subject to a long-standing debate about the role of structures and institutions versus the role of culture and ideas in explaining fertility developments. And scholars, Nordic scholars now are turning towards new theories and explanations going beyond structures and institutions. For instance, based on the Swedish development, scholars suggest a subjective turn where the decision to become a parent has become less determined by different factual circumstances and more by perceived certainties, uncertainties, and subjective imaginations of the future, which is including less foreseeable and controllable uncertainties related to the global development that has little to do with the Swedish situation. And this is in parallel to what Thomas talked about. Another example is that based on this study of the changing intentions in Norway, these authors are arguing that maybe theories that are considering individualization and self-realization as key factors are more relevant to understand the changes in childbearing. So the Nordic fertility decline also questions the prediction of high fertility in the presence of high gender equality. A recent study contends that fertility intentions expose a gender equality fertility paradox in the Nordic countries. Among men and women without children, those holding non-egalitarian gender role attitudes show the highest intentions to have children, while egalitarians, which is the largest group in this population, shows the lowest. So egalitarians prioritize parenthood as a life goal lower. But it's interesting also that among those already parents, attitude profiles and intentions of another birth are not associated. So I think that this raises interesting questions that we might look more into interactions between institutions and culture. Family policy system may have varying impacts on different stages in the family formation. Final point, what are work-family policies for? It is pointed out that low fertility was long viewed as a temporary and it was expected to reverse with further development as gender equality improves and social development continues. But new data shows no rebound. Fertility has continued to fall. And some demographers argue that in regard to pronatalist policies, it's very unclear what fertility levels should be considered optimal from a societal perspective. Moreover, persistently low fertility does not necessarily lead to adverse economic outcomes. It's actually argued that under certain conditions it may align with improved societal well-being. And I also want to make the point that continuous spread of gender egalitarian attitudes may not lead to rising fertility rates. And this idea has actually been criticized before, that as a very simplistic and empirically doubtful idea. And I think it can be argued that gender equality should not be used instrumentally. It is a goal in its own right. And if you look at the Nordic countries, they have endorsed gender equality without looking at its fertility impact. It's integrated to a broader political concept of social rights and of social and economic equality for all. Research suggests a relatively weak link between family policy intervention and quantum changes in fertility. And several scholars call for a rethinking about the goals of work-family policy. For example, Gauthier and Gittel-Basten, they argue that a successful family policy should be measured by how it contributes to the welfare of families with children, rather than how it impacts on fertility. And what is needed is a holistic approach to policy making, one that prioritizes enhancing people's opportunities and quality of life as a means of achieving desired social outcomes, including higher fertility. Signaling broad support for families is probably the strongest support for fertility. And to me, this sounds very much like what we have been thinking of as the old Nordic work-family policy design. Thank you for your attention.